Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of my Expansionscapes podcast, where I talk all things expansion. My name is Olga Aydinoğlu, and I'm a shamanic healing practitioner, an author, and an artist. In this episode, I'm going to share with you a story that came through for me from my spiritual team and my soul, and some of the beings I work with that I felt is worthy of sharing. And the story is called The Mountain and the Lake. So without further ado, I will begin the story. The Mountain and the Lake. This is the story of the mountain and the lake. There was once a mountain and a lake. For millennia, they lived side by side. The mountain's ice caps would melt. The water would flow down the ridges and troughs of the mountain, replenishing the lake through streams and estuaries that filled the lake always without fail. The lake, in turn, full of its waters, cradled many fish and nourished a rich forest life around it. The plants it nourished fed the insects and the animals. The animals ate the fish. There was always life and plenty of movement around the lake, which created many stories, which the mountain loved watching and rejoiced at all of it together with the lake. The mountain and the lake loved each other. They were together for such a long time that even they did not remember when exactly they became the mountain and the lake. They were as old as time. And their stories were plenty, like the number of rocks on the mountain, like the number of fish in the lake. One day, the mountain noticed that the lake was getting smaller. Each day it became a little smaller, and smaller again. Such seasonal changes were normal, but no matter how much the mountain focused on sending more water towards the lake, it just wouldn't grow bigger. The mountain swore an oath to itself and to the lake that it will not let the lake dry. It was the mighty mountain of many seasons and thousands of years. It swore that it will bring the lake back to its original size, and never shall the lake fear that it will dry. The mountain gathered up all of its might and all of its mountain power. It tensed and it heaved and it roared and it cracked. But the mountain saw that it could not bring any more water from its mountain tops than what was there. The mountain could not imagine a life without the lake. The lake grew smaller and smaller day by day. The mountain, trying every day to send as much water to the lake as it could, felt powerless and terrified that it may not be able to save the lake. It roared at the clouds. It roared at the rain and the snow, for them all to come and send more water onto its ice caps, more water onto its rocks, so that it could send all of that water down to the lake. But the waters of the sky brought scarce rain and little snow, until the lake disappeared and the mountain was left alone. The mountain was overwhelmed with guilt and shame, and it blamed itself for not having saved the lake, for not being enough. It decided that it was not deserving of any more happiness and joy and plenty. It was angry and it was sad. It was in dismay and deep despair. It trembled and it shook, and it did not believe itself to be the great mountain anymore, the way it always knew itself to be. It did not even want to be the mountain, for why be the mountain that could not save the lake? Why be the mountain that betrayed the lake in its promise? Why be the mountain without the lake at all? So this is a story that I received from my soul and my guides and some of the other beings I work with when I was working on my own stuff, specifically just like the mountain, there was a part of me in a certain lifetime where I was feeling, I was being very down on myself, and I was feeling a lot of shame and guilt, and I was blaming myself for not having created more abundance for a group of people. It was like a town of people for which I was like a steward of. So there were parts of me that were beating myself up for not having been able to create it, even though I actually tried my best in that lifetime, and they were actually pretty good. They were doing kind of well, better than other towns actually, but I was convinced that I could do better, and I didn't. And so I decided that I was unworthy of experiencing abundance and joy and a life of plenty myself, because I did not provide like a huge amount of it to those people, which still follows me around today, which is how it often happens, as I learned it through experience, studying this kind of work, practicing this kind of work. So this is still following me around, that part of me that said, okay, well then you don't deserve abundance. And then I sat down, diving deep into myself. I asked my guides to help me with this, and my soul. And well, that's the story I got. And when I don't hear stories in words. I see it like a movie, and not even just like a 2D movie, but more like I'm there. And I also felt the teaching was that I saw the mountain and the lake acting out the story, almost like actors in a theater, and I felt continuously an underlying truth, which was like, this is ridiculous and impossible, because this was a story of limits and boundaries. At the core of the story, I feel what happened was there was a breach of limits and boundaries. The mountain took responsibility for the waters of, I called it the heavenly waters, or what did I call it? The waters of the sky. It decided that, oh, I am going to try really hard and pour enough water down my sides, so down my lands, so that I can replenish the lake again. But I was feeling this underlying absurdity that the lake and the mountain were communicating to me at the same time. It's like I was getting the play of the story, while at the same time I was getting the truth, the underlying truth, that this is impossible, that this is ridiculous, in fact. And I'm going to share some examples of how we do this in our life, as my guides and my soul showed it to me. I hope it's useful for someone out there who may have done that themselves. I know I have. I know I still do in many ways. I hope this is useful for someone to let go of some of the possible shame, blame, and guilt that they may be holding within themselves, perhaps even unconsciously, which is often how it happens. Sometimes it's conscious, depends also how much we sit with ourselves and become more aware of ourselves and what's going on inside. Yeah, it is my intention that through these examples, someone out there may release some of that guilt, shame, blame for not having been enough, for something that they vowed to be or decided that they will be, where it wasn't actually possible for them to do that thing. Like the mountain couldn't control how much rainfall it's going to get. And then when I was still in the story of the lake and the mountain, my guides were explaining or showing that the mountain assumed many things. First of all, it assumed that it's in its freedom of will, and it's the decision of the mountain how much water is going to go into the lake. My guys were explaining that, let's say the lake is a personality here living like me, and the heavenly waters are like our soul energy, something that has deeper consciousness and has more information, or has more behind the scenes knowledge of why we came here and what are we doing here, because sometimes that needs to be kind of hidden, even though now we're in that age where the veil of consciousness is getting very thin, and we can kind of blend with our higher knowledge or inner knowledge, whichever direction you want to go. I don't feel that something is necessarily higher or lower, but anyway. And what my guys were saying is the mountain did not consider that the lake has its own freedom of will, and even though the personality may not have even known it, but maybe the soul had a desire to experience having a life of being a dry lake. It had thousands of years of being a lake full of water. What about an experience of being a dry lake? Or there are many ways of how it can go for humans. And the mountain did not consider that. And it couldn't see or know or realize that the waters didn't come because that was what the soul of the lake wanted. It wanted to experience itself as a dry lake, perhaps. And no amount of trying from the mountain would change that. And it's not even up to the mountain in any way, shape, or form to influence the desire of the lake, because that's the freedom of will and choice of the lake, and not that of the mountain. So that's where the breach of limits and boundaries kind of happened. And though it can happen, and yet it somehow never does happen, because the mountain, even though it tried, it couldn't change the fact that the desire of the lake was that to experience itself as a dry lake. And the mountain, even though it tried and kind of violated those limits and boundaries of itself and the lake and even the waters that came from the above, it couldn't. And in some ways you can think that the waters that come from above is like our soul energy. Yeah, and the lake is a personality incarnated here. So then naturally those waters would be coming to nourish the experience that is being sought by the soul of the lake. Even though that experience may be that of being a dry lake for maybe 1,000 years, and then maybe it's going to be full of water again. I don't know. That's the expansion journey of the lake. And I was shown 2 examples of how human beings may be doing something similar to this story of the mountain and the lake. So one way that I was shown it is when I was a teacher. So I was a teacher of kids, but sometimes we taught adults too, and I'm not going to touch the topic of kids here. So I'm going to say, let's say you have a class with adult people who came to study English, and there's the English teacher. And some of the adults came to study English because they need a certificate that they finished this course, because their employer said that if you go there and take a course in English, and you bring the certificate here, you will get that promotion, or you will get that raise, or you will get something. So then the person goes and goes to the course for the certificate, and let's say they're not interested in studying English at all. They just want to get it over with because they're not really excited about it. And then there's somebody else, another student who came to that course, not even knowing that there will be a certificate, but they have some desire in their life. They have some things that they want to achieve in life, or maybe just the knowledge of English, really. They just want to learn English for some reason. I don't know. Maybe they have a boyfriend or a girlfriend and they need to speak English, or maybe they want to travel, or maybe they want to read books, or maybe they want to watch YouTube videos, I don't know, in English. And they have this desire and drive and passion to study the language. And then there's the teacher. And let's say the teacher is the mountain and the students are the lakes. And the teacher, let's say the teacher's doing his or her best, okay? They're doing their best. They're doing everything they know how to do, and they're teaching. They have a good intention. They want their students to know English. And one of them just never listens, never cares, and never learns anything. And another one goes home and reads a lot of extra material and asks a million other questions and learns English faster than any other student before. And let's say there are other students that's somewhere in between of that scale. So I used to be a teacher who was very terrified of teaching, and I thought I wasn't good enough. And I actually was terrified of teaching because I expected, like the mountain, that every single one of my students must be absolutely amazing in the subject that I teach at the end of the course. Otherwise, it means I'm a failure as a teacher. And I have no business being in the school, and I have no business being a teacher, and I should be ashamed of myself, and all that nasty stuff. But I think I keep forgetting, and we keep forgetting as human beings, that it takes two to tango. I can do all the best that I can as a teacher, and maybe I'm a mediocre teacher, fine, whatever. But I'm doing my mediocre stuff, okay? Let it be. But it takes two to tango. The student also has their own freedom of will, their own desire, their own passion, their own heavenly waters, their own rain and snow that nourishes their lake, what they do as a human being. So one of them did not have a desire to study English, they just wanted the certificate. So that person didn't have, let's say metaphorically, the rain and the snow falling because he didn't have a desire, and we don't have to judge him or her for that. Hey, I've been there, done that. I have a lot of certificates I just sat through and didn't really care for. Why? Exactly because my employer told me to get those. So it's not about judgment of good or bad, but that person just did not want to study the language. They just wanted the certificate, no judgment there. But when they don't have that desire and passion for it, blaming the teacher, that the teacher is a horrible nonsense teacher because this person doesn't know English now, is making no sense then. And the teacher could have been very stressed out and did not understand. I'm trying all my best. I'm trying and trying. I'm trying and trying. And this person just doesn't study. Why? I'm doing all kinds of motivational stuff and everything I learned at school, at the university where they made teachers. So the teacher, like the mountain, may feel absolutely ashamed, unworthy, and not even wanting to ever be a mountain, or not even wanting to ever be a teacher, because they decided that I'm not good enough. But they overlooked that it's not their freedom of will for that other human being to learn English or not. There is a breach of limits and boundaries. There's a breach of freedom of will. There's a breach of, I like to call it a free will jurisdiction. I have my own jurisdiction, and the student has their own jurisdiction of free will. And I can't possibly cross into that. And because of that misunderstanding or breach of the free will jurisdiction, the teacher may decide that I don't ever want to be a teacher because I'm not good enough. And then they will not express themselves as a teacher and express their life, their waters of life fully, if that is their passion, of course. And the other student who learned extremely well and quickly, well, again, it takes two to tango. Metaphorically speaking, that student had plenty of rainfall, had plenty of snowfall. And when it fell on the teacher, the mountain, and it went down the mountain, it really, really replenished the lake with a lot of water, because that student had that desire. That desire is the freedom of will, the choice, is the heavenly waters, I'm going to call them. In fact, that student had so much rain and snow that not everything even fell on the mountain, because they did stuff on their own. They read stuff on their own. They did things that even the teacher had nothing to do with. So that's one example that my guides gave me, how we can limit ourselves. We can say, hey, I'm not a good enough teacher. Or, hey, I'm not a good enough storyteller. Hey, I'm not a good enough painter. Hey, I'm not a good enough singer. Hey, I'm not a good enough artist, or whatever it is that you do. Because there was this other person who looked at your painting and had absolutely zero effect, had absolutely zero emotions, was absolutely unmoved. But that does not mean that you, the mountain, are not a good enough mountain. You're just being the mountain. You're being you. It is that person who has no passion or desire or interest or curiosity for your kind of art, or for your kind of teachings, or for your kind of storytelling. And it's absolutely okay. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. We don't need to breach the limits and boundaries and judge the passions and the desires of each other. Another example of the mountain and the lake type of thing happening for us sometimes is that my guides showed specifically to me because it was relevant to me, but see in what ways perhaps it could be relevant to some parts of you. So as you guys know, we can be healers to some seekers of healing in some instances, and we can be seekers of healing and the ones being healed by someone else, a healer, in other instances. So one time I was in this healing and teaching session provided by one of my teachers, and I decided to give him a compliment at the end of the session. I said, wow. Well, it was true though. It was true what I told him. I told him that, wow, I was feeling really horrible at the beginning of this. I wasn't expecting anything much because I was just in my darkness and in my anger and whatever. I wasn't having a good day at all, and more than one day. And I told him now at the end of the session, I'm just so different, and I'm so much lighter, and I don't feel that darkness at all anymore. And I really love his answer, because he said, "Good job, you." So I was trying to give him a compliment, because I thought, hey, he should know that he did a great job as a healer. And he said, "Good job, you." And I will never forget that, because it helped me to understand healing and teaching in this new, different light of, and even though, we may mentally understand these things already, like from years ago, parts of us may not be in that place, or may be in too emotional of a place, or maybe in too painful of a place to kind of digest it, or know it, or feel it, or know it as truth. You know how they say you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink? Or you can say, I can open the door for you, but I can't walk through it for you. You have to do that. And that's what he was referring to when he said, "Good job, you." He said, "Good job, you allowed yourself. You decided for yourself. You allowed yourself to," I don't remember the exact words now, but you allowed yourself to let go of this stuff. You decided to let go of it. Good job, you. And I feel like there's a metaphor of when I enter his session space, he opens a bunch of doors. He opens a bunch of doors, and he creates this very clean space. And, or he takes me to a bunch of lakes. He takes me to a bunch of water, sources of water. But it is up to me to drink that water. It is up to me to walk through those doors. And it is possible that, let's say in a session or a teaching/healing class, he opens a lot of doors. He takes me to a lot of water, and I choose not to drink any of it, and I choose not to walk through any of the doors. And I just know that he will come out of that session not feeling that he's a bad healer or teacher, because he feels and recognizes and discerns on deeper levels than I at least did on that day, limits and boundaries. He will not walk away feeling, oh, I'm a lousy healer. Oh, I'm a lousy teacher. That person didn't walk through any doors, didn't drink any water. Pfft, I suck. I don't think I'm going to be a healer anymore. I don't think I'm going to be a teacher anymore, because I'm not good at it. Because look at all the people, or like, look at her. She didn't respond to any of my stuff. And I feel like there's also an aspect of arrogance if we tend to think like that about ourselves. Like, I know that I caught myself many times thinking that I'm not a good enough healer. There's parts of me that say things like, because you can't heal fast enough and significantly enough, like almost magic, like somebody comes in with no arm and suddenly an arm grows back, like that kind of level or something. There are voices, parts of me saying that your healing of layer by layer, piece by piece, part by part, that's just ridiculous. That's just nonsense. That's like too little. You're not good enough. You need to be this crazy magician or something. And I understand that some part of it is it's complicated. There's fear in it, and there's arrogance as well. But I feel like everything is trickling down to limits and boundaries, because you wouldn't have that arrogance if you wouldn't think that someone else's decisions depend on you. So what I was getting at, just like when there's a teacher and a student, where we are both in life, we're both teachers and we're both students always, we're also in some parts of our lives healers, and in some parts of our lives we're the ones experiencing healing or allowing healing to take place. What I'm getting at here is how my guides showed me, well, the mountain in that case is the healer. And many times my guides mentioned that me as a spiritual healer, I am like a conductor. I help people get in touch with themselves, to reconnect with themselves. And then it's up to them what they want to do, because it's not my jurisdiction of free will and decision making to make decisions for them. All I can do is just open that door or lead them to that water. In this case, to the flying water in the sky, which we can say is like our higher self or something. So they mentioned, like, let's say the mountain is the healer and the lake is the person who seeks the healing. And the mountain can't make decisions for the lake. That is like a breach of the sacred limits and boundaries of free will. And even if the mountain thinks that it can, it still can't. If the mountain thinks that, things just go bad for the mountain, where the mountain starts blaming itself and shaming itself and saying that you're not a good enough mountain. You're not a mountain at all. In fact, I don't want to be a mountain. So they were showing that in some ways, shapes and forms, and let this be just a limited metaphor, the healer is the mountain that connects the lake, the person, incarnated personality, with its waters. And the waters in the sky is also the lake, but let's say it's the soul. So the mountain helps to reconnect, to bring those waters of the soul of the person, and helps them to kind of reunite and reconnect. Helps the electricity conduction, if you will. And then it's their choice between the soul and the person who's seeking healing. Is their choice what they want. And it is not in the jurisdiction of the healer or the teacher or the artist or the singer or any types of professions, I don't know, a mountain can be. It is not up to that person. Let's say you painted a painting and it is not, it's kind of like it's not up to you what the viewer of your painting is going to experience. You may have experienced certain things and you may have put certain intentions into your artwork and even certain messages. But that person viewing your artwork will experience it in their own way. And that's the beauty of this freedom and the limits and boundaries, that I am not you and you're not me. And getting back to the lesson of my spirit guides in the mountain and the lake, what they were trying to, help me with, and perhaps this is useful for someone out there, maybe you, is to look at those instances where we breach the limits and boundaries and we cross into the jurisdiction of another, of their own free will, and we assume that that's ours. I am gonna be such a great healer because I will convince them to heal in 3 seconds. I will convince them to change their mind, and I will convince them to shine and to, I don't know, to do fancy stuff, whatever, to heal. I will convince them. But not only is this breaching, but also it's impossible. And it only hurts ourselves. It only hurts us. Because if we come from that perspective of, I can convince them, I can do this for them, I can help them make that decision, which is theirs to make, actually. If we're coming from that false place, and it doesn't have to be only healers and people seeking healing, can be just a friendship, really. It can be a husband and wife relationship, it can be parent and child relationship, can be a human and cat relationship, where sometimes I think I can convince my cats to do something and I always learn that I can't. And when we're coming from that false place of, I know I can convince them or something like that, or I know I'm just like, I need to be good enough of something, like a healer, a teacher, whatever, a painter, to inspire this in them. And I feel like to the amount of breaching we do into their jurisdiction with our own minds and thoughts and intentions, like that's the amount we actually hurt ourselves. They have their own stuff going on. They may or may not feel that breach at all. Because nothing can really breach it in some ways, shapes and forms, on some levels. I feel that our free will can be breached if we allow it. And sometimes we do. And sometimes we do it a lot. Just as we falsely breach other people's limits and boundaries. So to that extent that we breach and try to enter someone else's free will, to that extent we hurt ourselves. To that extent we give ourselves stuff like shame, blame, guilt, unworthiness, senses of inadequacy and everything. So the underlying topic here, or lesson, I would say, is if we go back down within and reanalyze and remember those limits and boundaries, and just what is my role here, let's say as a teacher, as a healer, as a as a painter, as a family member, as a cat or dog owner, then we will experience a sense of release, and we will experience a sense of freedom that, like, my teacher wouldn't go out of the class thinking that he's a lousy teacher because I chose not to use what he's giving. In the same way, I feel that we can release those false perceptions and false expectations and false fears and false, fears of being inadequate. And maybe not only as a healer and artist, but as a public speaker. We can experience that sense of release of all the stuff that doesn't need to be there. And all the stuff that's limiting us from expressing ourselves, expressing who we are, naturally. Okay, I was just talking about cats, so the cat came here. So that we can release expectations that are just false. And we can just let the lake be. If the lake wants to dry out, it does not mean the mountain wasn't a good enough mountain. It means there were reasons. That was the free will of the lake. Because the lake is made of water. And it was the water from the skies that was always replenishing the ice caps. And it was not the mountain who was producing that water. And again, it's a metaphor. So to close up this talk, which I hope it was useful, to sum up this contemplation of limits and boundaries and how it leads to things like guilt, shame, blame, and feelings of self-inadequacy and unworthiness. And then we decide that, oh, I'm unworthy to receive abundance and joy, and I'm unworthy to express myself as something that is me, that is I want to express myself as, limiting our life potential, allowing ourselves to dive into the nature of limits and boundaries, which by this complicated chain of events can really, really fix a lot of things and can really, really help the release of a lot of limiting and blocking things we experience in our life. A lot of reasons why we may choose to stay quiet when we wanted to speak. A lot of reasons why we may choose not to paint when we wanted to, or reasons why we did not want to connect to a group of friends when we wanted to, or do a bunch of things that actually we wanted to, but we limit ourselves because of that much stuff that came from an internal misconception and false kind of breaching of our free will limits and boundaries. So to sum up this mountain and lake story lesson that I learned myself and I wanted to share, I have some questions for inner inquiry that you may wish to ask yourself. And even if you don't have answers right now for yourself, you may just kind of keep them for later, for when various parts of you may wish to answer them. And I wanted to mention that sometimes we logically know things like limits and boundaries. I know that this is your free will and this is my free will, and I'm not going to breach it. So logically and mentally, sometimes we're really good at that. But there are some parts inside of us that couldn't care less about logic, that may be screaming with pain, that may be shutting themselves up with guilt, shame, blame, and all that stuff, feelings of self-inadequacy and more, unworthiness. There may be some parts of us who don't want to listen, who don't want to talk. They're just hurt, and they may mentally know this stuff too, but they're not ready or not in a position, not in a space to have mental conversation and logic. At least this is from my experience. And storytelling helps with that, because when we read a story or when we tell a story that has exactly what they need to hear, those parts of us are listening to that, getting into that story, because it's not about them, it's about someone else. And they naturally connect. They feel connected to that story, and they naturally tend to listen. Because if you're talking about a story where there's a similar pain that the parts of us are experiencing, they will perk up and, put their ears up like cats, and they'll listen, because they will hear a similar story of similar kind of pain. And the story is somewhat about someone else. So then it's easier to get engaged with that story and having the desire to help the person or whoever, the mountain in the story, because you have compassion. If you have similar pain, you have compassion for that mountain. You genuinely feel a desire from within those parts to help, to change, to help someone they're hearing in the story that has a similar pain, because they can connect. And by hearing that story and hearing the resolution of the story and hearing why the problem came about in the beginning, those parts of us may experience healing and release just from a story, because we weren't trying to shut them up, or we weren't trying to change them, or we weren't trying to invalidate them, or we weren't trying to tell them that they're not okay the way they are, or they shouldn't have these feelings, or whatever it is. We were just reading a story. That's it. So, here's some questions for inner inquiry. And why I mentioned the whole thing is, if you feel that this does not relate to you today, the story of the mountain, the lake, perhaps some inner parts on deeper consciousness levels that you may not be aware of right now may be listening, and you can invite them to listen, and you can invite them to ask questions, and you can invite them to not answer anything and just be okay with questions hanging out in the air, and let these be open doors that those parts of you that may or may not exist may choose to walk through some of those doors by answering those questions and experiencing a change, or they may choose not to, which is also okay at this time. Today is just today. There is also tomorrow. In what way is any part of you like the mountain? Where in your life do you assume responsibility for something you have no control over? Where in your life do you assume responsibility for something or someone that is not in your jurisdiction of free will and free choice? Have you ever felt ashamed, guilty, and blamed yourself for not doing enough for another person, place, or event? How much of what you tried to do was not in your realm of control and free will? How much of it was theirs, in their realm of control and free will? How did it come about that the limits and boundaries of you and the other person, place, or event became blurry, were penetrated, given up, overtaken, and redrawn, that did not fit the nature of either of you? In what way is any part of you or another like the lake, expecting someone or something else to provide it with the waters of life, when it is their waters of life, and it is up to them to call those waters of life from within themselves for themselves? In what ways have you ever despaired that you couldn't do enough for another person, place, or event that was not in your jurisdiction of free will and choice? That you decided that you are unworthy and not good enough, or that something is wrong with you, or that you are less than, and decided that you're no longer worthy of joy, health, abundance, lightness, happiness, and freedom to live your own self, your own life. And finally, allow yourself not to force the metaphor be more than what it is, the metaphor of the mountain, the lake. Allow the metaphor to be the mountain, while you are the waters above and the lake below. That is its nature, and let it be what it is, no less and no more. These are its sacred boundaries, within which it is, and outside which it is not. Its limits and boundaries are sacred, not just because they are limits and boundaries, but because in interacting with it, or anything else that has limits and boundaries, you get to experience your own self. Where another ends and you begin. You get to experience and appreciate your own limits, and boundaries. You get to appreciate your own you-ness, your own nature, while appreciating the nature and boundaries of another. With each interaction, you know more of yourself and appreciate the other. You begin to feel more and more of your own vessel, into which you can allow the flow of love. Loving and appreciating that which is you, and being able to love another in their nature, not needing them or forcing them to do or be anything else but themselves. In pouring and experiencing love in your own self, nature, and boundaries, you feed and nurture your own self's expression, to be more of you, to expand, to speak and sing itself more into existence, to be fruitful and multiply, so that you can see, appreciate, and love more of yourself. Finding a sacred retreat within yourself, sanctifying yourself with your own eyes of seeing, heart of loving, and voice of singing. Love yourself today, no less and no more. Be here now. You've got you to explore. And on this, I'm going to say thank you. Do let me know in the comments of wherever you're listening to this, what came up for you. Was this useful? Was it not useful? Why was it useful? Why was it not? I'm interested anyway. Thanks for being here with me in this space, and I hope to see you again. Bye-bye.